this was me as a teenager. On the surface, it seemed like I was doing pretty well. I had a supportive family, a solid group of friends, and to top it all off, I was the captain of my high school cross-country team, so just cool enough to not be falling in the bottom of the social heap at school. However, underneath the surface, I was a teen who was beginning to struggle with mental health issues. By my mid to late teen years, I would be diagnosed with an eating disorder that would threaten my life. My struggle with the eating disorder was one of the toughest things I would ever experience. However, slowly but surely, I started to navigate my mental health issues. I started to realize that in order to find a sense of safety and security within myself, I needed to look inward rather than outward for validation. Inspired by my struggles, I decided to take a degree in psychology in my undergraduate years. And in my third year of college, I started a group on campus called Body Banter, which aimed to empower young people to spark conversations about body image. A couple of years later, I started Body Banter as an established registered charity here in Hong Kong. Thank you so much to everyone for coming to my TED Talk today. It's been a real pleasure. Wait a second. I'm not quite ready to relinquish my TED stage just yet. That, my friends, was just what I like to call my nice narrative of mental illness. It's the story that has an uplifting storyline, a linear progression, the one with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Here's a storyline that might sound familiar to you if you grew up with Disney movies. We start with a happy princess who lives in a peaceful kingdom. Afterwards, we come to the middle of the story where a dragon viciously attacks and a prince comes in to save the day. And at the end, the prince wins. He slays the dragon, and the princess and the prince live happily ever after. And only if we're feeling just that little bit more creative today, we might say that they decided to adopt a pet frog. But the point is, for the most part, this is a storyline that's pretty predictable. The progression is one that you could expect if you watch enough of these movies, grew up with Disney. This is also the kind of predictable plot line that you might start to see a lot of if you've noticed a genre of storytelling that's emerged more and more in recent years in Hong Kong. And this kind of storytelling is known as mental health recovery storytelling. It features first-person accounts of people's experiences with mental illness and navigating recovery afterwards. And the progression of these storylines are quite linear, as you might start to notice. As many of you may recognize, Hong Kong has had a long-standing issue of mental health stigma, which has discouraged a lot of people from sharing their struggles openly. So what changed? What allowed this trend of storytelling to emerge? Well, the COVID pandemic brought about a widespread awareness that it really isn't so uncommon at all to experience feelings of isolation, anxiety, uncertainty, and that led many more people to feel confident in sharing their struggles for mutual empowerment and connection. And so this trend really started to emerge more and more in Hong Kong, and that's absolutely something to celebrate. However, in addition to celebrating this progress, I'd like to suggest that we should also complicate the picture. I'd like to suggest that stigma, it manifests not just in the lack of dialogue. It manifests in diluted dialogues, conversations where we merely graze but don't really grapple with the stigmatized issues at hand. I'd like to suggest that we need to stop being nice when we talk about mental health. And to build that argument, I'd like to invite you on a journey with me to look back at my nice narrative and suggest 3 ways that we can disrupt it. You ready? Okay. So, I'd like to first point your attention toward this graph, and it comes from research that was conducted by a linguist called Hazel Price. And what we see here is her research on the mental health discourse in the United Kingdom. So what we see here is 2 trend lines reflecting the usage of the terms mental illness, which is represented by the darker line at the bottom, and mental health, which is represented by the lighter line at the top. And while we can see that the overall trend is that both these terms increase in their frequency between the years 1985 to 2013, what's even more captivating is when we look at this red bubble here and we zoom in. We see here that the trajectories of these two trend lines diverge. Importantly, what we see actually is that the trend line for mental health, it doesn't just increase. It surges upward with gusto until by the year 2013, the usage of mental health has almost doubled in frequency in comparison to mental illness. So, why might we see this trend occur? Well, there are many different possible explanations, of course, but a captivating explanation that Price puts forward is that it can be chalked up to the fundamental human tendency to use more palatable, more inoffensive alternatives to terms that we might find stigmatizing. Conversations, for example, about disease and illness. How we might see this reflected in the mental health discourse is like this, for example. A mental health researcher might say, global rates of mental health issues, such as obsessive compulsive disorder, have skyrocketed in recent years. And what we see here is that the term mental health issues is used in place of the term mental illness, which is more precise, even though this sentence directly addresses the topic of a clinical diagnosis, obsessive compulsive disorder. We also might see this if a mental health advocate is saying, we really need to talk more about mental health. Here, using a more general category to talk about the more precise thing that we actually do need to talk more about, which is mental illness. What I'm highlighting here is that these patterns of usage that are sprinkled in our everyday conversations, they do start to build up and accumulate into pervasive patterns at the population level, and that can be seen in graphs like what we saw in Price's research. And it becomes a pattern of discourse where we systematically undermine the distress that people with mental illness face every day. And this is reflected in tangible consequences. It's not just blocking off a critical area of conversation, but in the lives of everyday people. We see this in the nearly 50% of Hong Kongers who will choose not to seek help for their mental illness because they simply don't see it as significant enough. We see this in the 46% of Hong Kongers who believe that the main cause of mental illness is a lack of willpower and discipline. These are the people who might think, well, why extend compassion and empathy to a peer or a colleague with mental illness? Because after all, aren't these just issues that you can easily push through or get over? And clearly, I'm not trying to establish a causal relationship between our patterns of discourse and these consequences I'm showing here. However, what I am saying is that our linguistic patterns reinforce and reflect how we think, feel, and act toward mental illness in our society. And so, if I were to change one small thing about my nice narrative, going back now, I would just start with doing this. Instead of saying, I was beginning to develop some mental health issues, I would say, I was in the early stages of developing a mental illness. And instead of saying, I started to recover from my mental health issues, I'd say, I started to navigate recovery from mental illness. In short, I would dare to name it. I would choose precision over palatability. I would say it as it is. Now, let's move on to the next little bit of our conversation today. And I'd like to bring you back to my nice narrative, and in particular, what I focused on in my nice narrative as I was telling it. As you might remember, I told you that I started off as a seemingly happy teen, after which I was viciously attacked by the dragon, i.e. the eating disorder, and I, as my own prince, fought it off. And my happy ending came in the form of surviving the eating disorder and starting Body Banter. So what you might notice here is that it focuses on me as the resilient, determined protagonist of my story. And I'm not gonna lie, this storyline makes me feel hella good about myself. It's super ego boosting. It makes me feel really determined and brave and like the hero of my story. However, this nice plotline, this comforting plotline, it omits mention of the fact that for so many people who struggle with mental illness, it is not merely an issue of whether or not you have enough resilience or determination to get through. That's certainly part of it, but it also relies on whether or not you have the knowledge it takes to even navigate the mental health care infrastructure where you live. It depends on whether or not you have the financial means to sustain your access to appropriate forms of care. And it depends on the social support systems that you have around you that allow you to access these forms of support without feeling judged or discriminated against. And so, if I were to revisit my nice narrative now, I'd scrap that whole middle section and instead say, in recovery, I was lucky to have access to numerous resources like family support, financial means, and some degree of knowledge about the Hong Kong healthcare system that offered me significant advantages over others in Hong Kong who struggle with eating disorders and other mental illnesses. In other words, I would celebrate this complexity, this dynamic interplay between personal, interpersonal, and societal factors that shaped my experiences with mental illness and eventually mental health recovery. Okay, so in this last little bit of time we have together, I'd like to start off by showing you a video, which I hope you enjoy. I am sure, and I hopefully assume, that I am not the only person in this room who is writhing in discomfort after watching that video. And I think the main reason for many of us here is that there was no sense of resolution to anything we saw there. Chances are, sadly, we will probably never find out what happens to that watermelon, or those swinging eggs, or that wobbly pudding at the end. And this also points us in the direction of why we might lean into nice narratives. For my mental illness nice narrative, my struggle at the start led to a comforting eventual success. And that is something that is very irresistibly satisfying for many of us. However, this comforting narrative omits the mention of the fact that all people with mental illness, they find different ways, a colorful array of possibilities as to how they find meaning and healing in recovery. For some people, they may never need to take psychiatric medications again. However, for others, taking psychiatric medications is precisely how they can live meaningfully in recovery. For some people, entirely closing the chapter on their experiences with mental illness is the surest way for them to move forward. However, for others, like myself, my experiences with mental illness continue to inform my life today in a meaningful way. It's the reason why I can bring empathy to my life with my loved ones, but also in my community work. So, if I were to revisit my nice narrative for a final time today, I wouldn't end by telling you about body banter. I would end by saying this. That's all the time I've got to share my story with you today. But that is by no means the end of my story. In fact, as I stand here today sharing this TED stage with you, I'm continuing to write my story. In other words, I would dare to leave my story unfinished. I would remind you and me that every story we tell and hear, it's not the end of that dialogue. It's an open invitation for continued reflection and conversation. So, as we close our conversation today, I'd like to point a question in your direction. What's your nice narrative? I'm assuming that many of us here have a social cause that's close to your heart. And perhaps you've used or considered using the tool of storytelling to promote this cause, to convince other people in your community that they should care about that cause as well. And if you have, I'd like to invite you to disrupt the niceness of your narrative in 3 ways. I'd like to invite you to dare to name it, to choose precision over palatability every chance you get. I'd like to invite you to celebrate complexity, to celebrate that dynamic interplay between personal, interpersonal, and societal factors that shape this cause you care about. And finally, I invite you to dare to leave your story unfinished. Let your stories breathe and evolve with the conversations, criticisms, and questions that you're going to have emerge from the continued dialogues that you're going to have with your community. Nice. That's not going to create the change we want to see. Nuance will. Noise will. Now, which will you choose? Thank you. That's really the end. Bye.